Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host Dr. Reed Robison and I give you a recap of our experience at the Delic conference in Las Vegas. Delic is a conference for psychedelic wellness and business industry professionals, and it was awesome. We had a great time down there. So I hope you enjoy our trip report. By the way, if you want to contact us about the show, you can email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. You can also find us on Instagram at Dr. Steve Thayer, at InnerSpaceDoctor, and at Novamind. Please enjoy. Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers.
Good afternoon.
How are you doing, Dr. Reed Robison?
Excellent. How are you doing, Steve?
I am also excellent. One of the reasons I feel so excellent is we just got back a week ago now from the Delic conference in Las Vegas. That was wild.
It was. I left my voice in Vegas. It's about 50% back.
Yeah, at one point you could barely even talk.
Yeah.
It was a great conference. So I thought today we would just sort of debrief and talk about the conference a little bit. And it was probably the third psychedelic-oriented conference I've been to. And I'm starting to notice something about these conferences. They are a mixture of human beings that you won't really find at other places. Like, it's such a fun mixture of academic scientists, medical and mental health professionals, psychonauts, old hippies, venture capitalists. It's such a fun. It's so interesting to see that psychedelics have pulled people from all these different walks of life and corners of the universe, united under one common interest.
I love that about the field in general, and you see it, feel it, experience it the most at those conferences. But I love that we have not only these disciplines coming together, but like you said, all walks of life. There are so many people interested in psychedelics for healing, for consciousness, for religious ceremonial purposes, and to get them all in the same room having a discussion or on the same dance floor is pretty cool.
Yeah, really cool. Yeah, and this was probably the most psychedelic of the psychedelic conferences I've been to. You know, the other conferences I've been to, there was the Arizona Psychedelics Conference in 2019. There was Scepter, the Intermountain Psychedelic Symposium that we had here in, when was that? Early 2020, or was it 2019?
2019.
Yeah.
January.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So these were more like your typical academic conferences on the topic of psychedelics. Although at the Scepter conference, we did have the drum circle during one of the coffee breaks. Yeah,
and the fun after party tied to the conference. In fact, when I went to the MAPS Psychedelic Science Conference in 2018, the fall, Parengi was there for the music afterwards, and it was a psychedelic experience just going to the entertainment after.
One of the things I liked about Delic, the one we just got back from, is that it was at a very psychedelic venue. So it was at Area 15 in Vegas, where the Meow Wolf exhibit is. And you walk in there, and it looks like a psychedelic trip in there.
Yeah, and I'd encourage everyone to look up Meow Wolf. And in fact, there's a documentary about it called The Origin Story, because this is a group of fringe artists that weren't necessarily accepted into the mainstream art scene. They were in Santa Fe at the time, but they banded together and essentially created this venue where anything goes, and it took off.
Yeah, it is a crazy experience. There's some fun videos on YouTube of the Meow Wolf experience, because it's not just at one place, right? They have a Meow Wolf in Vegas. They have one in New York. I can't remember the other locations.
Well, they just opened one in Denver.
Denver.
It started in Santa Fe, so I believe it's still there.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know how many they have total. But Vegas is apparently a pretty cool one. I didn't go through the actual exhibit, but the whole building was a trip. But in the exhibit, you enter through this grocery store called Omega Mart, and then you go into these portals to essentially another dimension through the grocery store.
Yeah, kind of an Alice in Wonderland experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another thing, the main stage, the walls were all projection screens. And during every talk, constantly, there was some psychedelic artwork, like moving and boiling. So it felt like you were on 3 grams of mushrooms as you're watching the speakers, And so they'd have the PowerPoint projected behind them, surrounded by this psychedelic artwork, which I thought was so cool.
It is. It's a pretty neat reminder that you can have a non-ordinary state of consciousness by things like that, which we know, of course, by breath work and entering these different kinds of flow states. But that was neat to do that together in a conference.
Right. Speaking of those non-ordinary states, brought on by non-medicine experiences, there were some cool companies there at booths featuring. I forget what it was called, but there was like a bed that had speakers in it and that would play music like through your body.
I have one.
Do you
You need to try it. It's at my house. It's called a vibroacoustic table.
Oh yeah.
And you can pump the music in, and it will like vibrate this whole giant pad you're laying on in unison with the beats and the music. And then I've paired it with these light glasses or goggles that will shine light even at, say, like a closed eyelid to simulate visuals. Or we've even paired it with virtual reality psychedelic experiences. It's pretty neat.
Yeah, there's an app on the Oculus Quest called Tripp, Tripp, that it's like a meditation app. It has some guided exercises in it, but it gives you really trippy psychedelic type visuals.
Yeah, and so I met the founder of that at a clinical trials conference a couple years back, pre-COVID, but then they just acquired a local company, co-founded by a friend of ours, Sonny Strasberg, who is now part of the Tripp team and leading the psychedelic therapy education division. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think all these things are cool because they increase access to altered states that, unless you're doing ketamine in the States, are hard to access in a medical context.
Do you remember trying that virtual reality headset that was mailed to clinic a number of months ago?
Yeah.
SoundSelf.
Yeah.
Started by a brilliant guy by the name of Robin out of Austin, and he had mailed us one. We met him at the MAPS conference that I was talking about, and people just loved trying it there. But in that experience, you start with these Oculus VR goggles on. You start by sitting at the base of a tree, breathing. But what he does is he uses sound, like toning. It's like you're doing a bunch of continuous ohms. If you've ever done that in a yoga class, it's a trip of its own. But and the experience responds to the sound, and the more you enter into this state of like visual, breath, and sound, the more you start to float away, and eventually you blast off through the ceiling of the regular default world into like a tunnel of fractals.
Yeah, when I tried it, it was pretty trippy, and I was at first a little self-conscious that everyone could hear me going, oh, like, toning into this machine. But after a while, I kind of got lost in the experience. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, we can get in our own way sometimes out of those fears of looking weird.
We do.
Deprive ourselves of some cool experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, so lots of cool people there too at the Meet Delic conference. Some names that people in the space would definitely recognize. I really enjoyed what was her name? Laura Dawn. I hadn't heard of Laura Dawn before. She's kind of kicked off the first day Saturday. Shamanic life coach, mindset mentor. She talked about psychedelics and creative problem solving.
And I remember some interesting feedback afterwards, because hers was foundational stuff, like reminders. It started out anyway with reminders about the importance of your mindset and setting intentions, and then getting into those creative possibilities. And I remember a friend of ours remarking about how oh, that was stuff I already knew. But then later on, looking back on it, they're like, wait a second, I needed that in order to get what I did out of the next ones.
Right. I think psychedelics are, uniquely suited to help us think creatively.
Mm-hmm.
Like some of the things that they do in the brain kind of suggest that they would be, right. They create this crosstalk between hemispheres in the brain. They quiet the default mode network, which is responsible for our normal consciousness and our sort of monkey mind chatter. And then they disinhibit us a little bit, so maybe we're willing to entertain certain types of thinking, out of the box thinking that we wouldn't normally entertain.
Yeah.
So, like you said, I think it was some foundational points, even if the talk wasn't as, interesting for some.
Yeah, I liked it, and I appreciated the content as a great starting place and a good. I love that topic too, of the potential of psychedelics to enhance creativity. Because I have always been intrigued by that possibility of how it can kind of dissolve these structures, our default mode network structures that get in the way of certain neurons and pathways firing, certain ideas and insights because of our deeply ingrained self-imposed limitations. I probably said it on here before, but if you want to know what it's like to have a psychedelic experience, have a tea party with a 4-year-old,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where anything is possible, everything's magical. And, and they have lantern consciousness, as you might call it, this broad, neurons firing, everything's wild and wonderful instead of our focused spotlight consciousness as grown adults.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really liked her talk. I think, I can't remember the timing, but Dr. Molly Maloof spoke about psychedelics as an aphrodisiac and psychedelic treatment for couples, or I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think she's working on developing maybe a microdose of something, maybe an MDMA derivative for sexual dysfunction, for people with hypoactive sexual desire.
Yeah, I think it was her on a Clubhouse panel back in the. I mean, Clubhouse is still around, but back in
It was cool for about a month.
The
Yeah.
Clubhouse heyday, there were some really neat discussions, and I remember at the end of this panel, they were talking about both kind of male and female sexual dysfunction and anorgasmia and things like that. And I remember her saying that someone needs to develop a drug to help women with sexual dysfunction, and if no one does, I'm going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty neat to see that she's involved in some pursuit around that much needed area. I think she points out that men have, Viagra and Cialis and these other interventions, but in for females there are more limited options or less well-known options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good for her. Super smart, super driven, creative. I'm excited to see kind of where she takes that.
Yeah, that was a neat talk. I love how she went through all the different substances, even obscure like ceremonial plant medicines that you may or may not be familiar with, and how they might have been used for different purposes, like libido or couples therapy, or accessing higher states in tantric bliss or whatever it may be. It was really fascinating.
Yeah, it makes me think of the promise for MDMA in particular for couples counseling.
Yeah.
MAPS is studying it for the treatment of PTSD. I remember in the military, when we were treating really complex PTSD cases, they almost always did better when we brought in their partner and made it more of a couples endeavor. Yeah,
when we talked to the old school MDMA therapists who were giving it back when it was legal to give it, they really miss MDMA for couples work, and I can totally see why. But there has been one couples study done, sponsored by MAPS. It was more of an investigator-initiated study led by Ann Wagner out of Toronto. She's super cool. She was my small group leader in my MAPS training last year, and she led this study where they gave MDMA to both members of the couple, where one had PTSD. And, when I heard that and saw the data, I was just intrigued because I think, like you were alluding to, the impact of one's mental health condition, such as PTSD, has far-reaching effects within the family unit, especially in the couple.
Yeah.
And to see the ripple effects in a clinical trial like that move through the couple, the partnership, both of their lives is pretty powerful.
Yeah. I think one of the things that makes psychotherapy effective is that it's a place where a person can be seen, heard, held unconditionally, validated.
Yeah.
And a lot of the problems in a partnership where one person has PTSD are that they sort of shut off from one another, particularly the one with PTSD, and it's hard for them to feel understood, especially if it's combat-related trauma, because a civilian doesn't understand that kind of thing, and seen. And so MDMA just has this wonderful way of allowing people to open up to one another and give the other the chance to see and validate and hold and understand.
Yeah, no, it's because we can step on landmines so easily in couples work, right? And put your weapons up so fast. It reminds me of the Gottman work, right? Of both the principles to approach that kind of work, like a soft startup, but what he calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, or things like stonewalling, for example, where, when those weapons go up, the productive session's over unless you have ways of really productively putting your dukes down.
Right.
And MDMA certainly, it creates a whole new environment for doing productive couples work.
Yeah. It's coming, folks. It's coming down the pipeline. We're excited for it. And we're prepping, at Novamind to be able to do a lot of good work with these medicines, doing lots of training and research, and we will hopefully be able to meet the demand, because I think the demand's going to be high.
Yeah, for sure.
So a couple other presentations. Jesse Gould was there from the Heroic Hearts Project, speaking of PTSD. He wouldn't know me, but I met him at the Arizona Psych Conference a couple years ago, and just love what he does. So that project is a nonprofit 501c3 that takes veterans down to the Amazon to do ayahuasca ceremonies. I think they also go to Jamaica to do mushroom retreats, and I think they've partnered with Imperial College at London to do a study on those retreats, specifically for veterans with TBI, with traumatic brain injury.
Amazing.
Yeah, love his work.
Yeah, Imperial College, I assume it's still open, but they've had this survey study going on for quite a while that's really neat, where they'll give questionnaires to people who are seeking their own psychedelic experiences in ceremonies, give you questionnaires before and detailed ones after, and they've been able to publish some really interesting things coming out of those.
Yeah. Yeah, didn't Fadiman do survey studies?
Yeah, on microdosing.
On microdosing, yeah. I just remember him at the Scepter Conference, the Intermountain Psychedelic Symposium, talking about microdosing being, in his opinion, according to the survey data, the convenient sample, more effective than Adderall for ADHD, for example.
Yeah, and it's interesting. After we brought Fadiman out for that Intermountain Psychedelics Conference, we had some meetings. We developed, a friendship with him and had some follow-up meetings on ways of collaborating. And I remember him saying, because we were talking about looking at his data and doing some more analyses or papers, stuff I like to do. And he said, "Oh, I don't do academic publishing anymore at this stage of my life and career. I'm tired of dealing with that. You can do it."
Yeah.
But yeah, I should add the disclaimer that there have been recent microdosing studies with mixed results, and there was a really interesting self-blinding study also out of Europe with some ties to Imperial College and other related institutions, where it was both LSD microdosing and psilocybin that those kind of studies are helping shine some light on the questions, because the survey data points us in great directions, but we really need more solid kind of blinded prospective studies, because microdosing has been one area that is just under-researched.
Right. There's so many confounding variables that you can control for in an organized study that you can't control for when you're just taking convenient samples, right?
In fact, as a clinical trialist, psychedelics are fascinating, and if they're paradigm shifting, because you have this several-hour dosing session where transformation occurs, like stuff we never would have imagined during training when learning about like the big 5 personality traits and seeing how like sticky they are. When a psychedelic medicine comes along and all of a sudden you have significant changes in openness or
decreases in neuroticism.
And to be able to study it in real time without the 1 million confounding variables that might happen through the course of an 8 to 12 week study when you're coming in once a week for measures to get your meds and you're taking a pill daily. It really is like Stan Groff said, where psychedelics are like a telescope or microscope that give us this new incredible tool to peer into the human psyche, to understand consciousness and the human brain in ways we just couldn't before.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like, with the resurgence of research, we're really only starting. Like we're just barely off the starting blocks. We're going to have a lot we're going to have new indications for these medicines. We're going to have combinations of medicines, ketamine with cannabis, MDMA with DMT or something like that. And then we're going to have new compounds, novel psychedelic compounds. I mean, Shulgin did a lot of the footwork, but we're going to have some, I think, really impressive new compounds coming out in a few years.
Yeah, and I'm pretty confident that next year at some point we'll be helping some of these drug companies, biotech companies, do studies of things like IV DMT, where you're talking about a 10 or 20 minute dosing experience.
So let's talk about one of my favorite portions of the conference, and that was Duncan Trussel.
Oh, he's amazing.
Duncan Trussel is a comedian. He's the host of the Duncan Trussel Family Hour, and he's just a wonderful human being. I mean, I think he is. I'm a fan. Never met the guy, but one of the things I like about him, apart from the fact that he's hilarious and that he's into psychedelics, is he's self-effacing and honest. It's one of the things I like about comedians is they are the gadflies of our modern culture.
Oh, yeah.
Like, they help us look at ourselves honestly. A laugh erupts from our subconscious when they say something that's true, that's taboo. Some of the really good ones, at least, are philosophers. They know the human mind. Like, sometimes I think the two types of people in the world, and this is gonna be super biased, but that really, really know the human mind are comedians, and then people who study the human mind, like philosophers, psychologists, scientists, or whatever.
But comedians make it so much more accessible.
Yeah, certainly more enjoyable.
I had a newfound appreciation for what you're talking about when Joe Rogan came to town, and I went and listened. And he really did, show how, there's value in being able to talk about anything, to not take ourselves so damn seriously,
right,
and to, just lay it all out there. The beauty and the folly of the human condition, all like explored in a lighthearted way.
Yeah. And I like that comedians are rascals and they're jesters, they're Lokis, You brought up Joe Rogan, you probably, half our listeners are going to be like, oh, Joe Rogan's a terrible person, and then they're going to be Joe Rogan fans. Like, regardless, whatever. I just love what you just said, like that comedians help us not take ourselves too seriously. Regardless of what you think about their personal opinions. They're just people, so they're going to have opinions that you don't share. But, Duncan, one of the things he said, because there were speeches by medical professionals, speeches by shamans, all kinds of people taking psychedelics really seriously, as they should. And then Duncan said something like, let's remember that psychedelics are also great for just unbridled hedonism. They're also just a really good time.
It can be fun.
Yeah. And I appreciated him saying that. That was hilarious.
I first learned of him when Midnight Gospel came out.
Yeah,
And there's
his
this
Netflix
intriguing cartoon on Netflix that I remember watching with when my kids were present. And, I'm all for, kind of looking together at, things that might be considered taboo and opening those discussions with kids. But it's a funny cartoon because some of those episodes can be quite gory. And I remember their jaws dropped at one of them. But one episode in particular, I will never, ever forget. Episode 8, I believe, where it's taken from his podcast, like they all are, right? But he's interviewing his mother before she passed away, and she was a psychotherapist with, Buddhist leanings, and they were talking about the cycle of birth and life and death, and just animated in this wild, weird way that is such a trip of its own.
Yeah, I remember that episode too. And it was emotional for me. Like, I'm laughing and then I'm crying. My dad had passed away, a few years ago, and so I'm watching this, knowing that his mother is now passed. Just watch it, folks.
Yeah, we'll link to it because it's a special work of art.
I think so. The perfect mixture of meaningful seriousness and absurdity.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I love about comedy is that, if you're funny enough and you're expert enough at it, you can package some really, really important messages in this really nice comedic wrapping so that it's easier to take.
Mm-hmm.
You can get points into places that other people can't.
Yeah, and what I took away from that episode in particular was that, even though there are these cycles of life where our human forms, are born and live and then die, there's this love that remains.
Yeah. I actually listened to his podcast this morning. He interviewed Jack Kornfield. He's had Jack Kornfield on a bunch of times.
Yeah, I've heard some of those.
But yeah, he's just so vulnerable and raw and honest, so relatable. Yeah, I'm a big fan.
He went out and met Ram Dass at one of the retreats Ram Dass did later in life in Maui.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's fun to hear about those stories too.
Another comedian who's similar is Pete Holmes. Similar in the sense that Pete Holmes, his personal life has been transformed by his experiences with psychedelics. Somebody who also sat with Ram Dass. And his book, Comedy, Sex, God, is really good. I like Pete Holmes. He also super vulnerable, really public about his struggles with his own mental health. And yeah, we'll link to his book in the show notes, but it's another good one, especially for people who maybe grew up in an Orthodox religion or an Orthodox spiritual tradition, who are trying to find their way in their adulthood, having left that spiritual tradition or religion. Pete Holmes shares his personal story with Catholicism and all the shame, sort of residual shame from growing up in that particular religion. It's really, really cool stuff.
Yeah, that's important stuff, and a good example of how you can really find some relatable insight through comedy when people share so openly their own experience, where you might not be able to talk about it with just anyone. There's another comedian, and his name has slipped my mind. You may know it, but he talked about how doing magic mushrooms helped him heal his anger issues. This is within the last
was that Bill
months.
Burr?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, Bill Burr's hilarious.
I don't know if he was on Conan when he described it, but it was really neat.
So I've been following Bill Burr for a while, and anger is sort of his shtick. He's the angry comedian. He's an angry dude. He's from Boston. He's always talking about being beat up and getting into fights. And his show, F is for Family, is a hilarious portrayal of those kinds of family dynamics. But it's been fun to watch him get more calm over the last few years. One, because he had a child, his daughter, and to hear him, this angry macho dude, talk about his love for his daughter is just awesome. And then he's had some psychedelic therapy. He hasn't lost his edge. He's still hilarious, but just more conscious. He has a special on Netflix. I forget which one it's called, but it's the one that's in black and white, and he's in front of a big church organ. And he talks about his departure from religion. And there's this one bit where it was like what's that Olympic event where they're on the ice and they curling.
Yeah.
He's like, it's that one of those that creepy moment in curling where you just let go of the stone and it keeps going, but you stop. And that's what it felt like. Just let go of my religion. It kept going and I just stopped. Yeah. He's great. I love Bill Burr.
And psychedelics, it brings up another thought that psychedelics and their, this whole sensory experience that can come with it create such interesting visual metaphors for the things we deal with in life and work through in therapy, like that curling one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So part of Duncan's, he did a live taping of the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't been released yet, so you'll all get to hear what we heard when it comes out on the podcast feeds. But he had Aubrey Marcus on the panel. So Aubrey also spoke. For those of you who don't know who Aubrey Marcus is, I guess currently he's was the founder of the company On It. It was just sold to Unilever. It's a supplement company. They also do fitness equipment and plans and things like that. Alpha Brain is his flagship nootropic, which I tried and it gave me a headache and didn't help. Sorry.
Interesting.
Apparently a lot of people love it. I didn't love it, but yeah, his speech was good. He's obviously a well-practiced orator, and he led us through a brief breathwork exercise. We did some ohms? Oh, was it like the shared tone thing? Was that him?
Mm-hmm.
Where we were all just made a tone, and then eventually we all got on the same wavelength. That was cool.
Yeah.
Cool, like oneness community building exercises.
Yeah, I love those.
He has this mastermind that he calls the Fit for Service Fellowship. And to be honest, I'm not sure how I feel about Aubrey Marcus. Like, I think his messages are often really, really good. He certainly has a devoted following. But there's some judgment that bubbles up in me about him and the way he approaches. I don't know how much I want to get into it.
Let's get underneath the hood of this, Steve.
This is a Steve problem, not an Aubrey Marcus problem. Every public person has fans, and they have people who aren't your fans. So I'm not going to say anything new about Aubrey. But yeah, like I admire him in so many ways. Maybe it's a little bit of jealousy because he talks a lot about mental health stuff and he gives good recommendations, and he kind of, this fit for service thing is about being your highest self and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not a mental health professional, and I'm not trying to gatekeep, because there are people I know that I would rather talk to about my problems that have no credentials than 100 different therapists that I know. So there's nothing magical about getting a license to be a psychotherapist that makes you like a magical person or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I like him, but
he's a mirror for something.
Some kind of trigger for me. Yeah.
And that's kind of fun to sit with and look at. Is like, why does that person bug me, even though they're saying some cool stuff?
Yeah, on the drive home, I was thinking about that. I'm like, okay, we often say on the podcast, triggers are friends to follow. I'm finding myself triggered by Aubrey Marcus. Where could I follow this trigger to? And it was good. It's been good for self-reflection for sure.
Yeah, no, I love that kind of personal work. Those are triggers or opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pathways to understanding.
The obstacle is the path.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, it is. Any other highlights from the conference, Reed, that you want to share with our audience?
Well, Lamar Odom was there, although we talked about him in a recent episode.
Yeah, with the Hemplucid folks. They were there, by the way.
Yeah.
The Hemplucid folks were there.
Oh, that was neat. During one of my favorite moments, for whatever reason, was when Aubrey Marcus was up on stage and he was telling a story where he was sitting down with his wife, and she got out this CBD bottle made by Hemplucid, and Hemplucid had a really fun booth presence there, kind of sharing some of their products, and he said that his wife handed him this, and instead of taking a little dropper, he drank like half the bottle.
Yeah.
And then they're just watching a show or something, and then all of a sudden he's like, "Oh no, I'm getting high." And it's interesting because in CBD, I don't know how much we want to get into this, but there is a percentage max of THC, and therefore if you had the whole bottle, you're going to get some THC, and CBD has its own interesting effects, like thought to be more kind of body-based, for example. But here he's having this body trip and a little bit of a mental trip, and he said, so he turns to his wife, and she's sleeping, like sound asleep. So he's like, "Oh, on my own on this one." And what he said next was kind of funny. He's like, he had some ketamine lozenges, presumably by prescription,
Right.
and so he takes one or two, and he's pretty poetic, right? He's pretty eloquent, and even calls himself a poet, writes poetry, and so his description of that experience was really neat. Like, he had everyone on the edge of their seats, and I did see people kind of afterwards going for the Hemplucid booth, and it was not a paid promotion. Like,
No.
I asked, of course, but I just had to ask, and our friends at Hemplucid were like, "Wow, he just came up to us afterwards and said, 'I have a fun story I'm going to share up there. Watch this.'" But yeah, that was really neat, and also interesting to think about. The work you can do. Like, he was doing some body-based, like, fascia work with these visual metaphors, this full sensory experience when you're in, like, a ketamine state of consciousness, going in with whether it's another substance in combination that we might be able to study someday, or if you're going in with a certain task at hand. The work he was doing on embodiment and the way he described it was really fun.
Yeah, it was something about his jaw and being able to feel the fascia move and loosen up. And
Yeah, like he could, and that is a hallmark of some psychedelic experiences. Like, I remember when I was first getting to know ayahuasca as a plant medicine, being taught by my kind of mentors, teachers, shamans, co-therapists, that sometimes you're just going to have a body trip. Like, there are a couple main types of trips with ayahuasca, DMT. It might be like a mental, emotional healing journey, or it could be a body-based one, and I've since realized that sometimes it's both. But my first ayahuasca experience, I've talked about parts of it, but I remember my legs cramping up. This is weird. I've never had, like, spontaneous cramping of legs when I'm not, like, swimming laps or, doing some kind of activity. And also one of the members of the medicine team, one of the shamans, came by doing some energy work that I'm not, that immersed in, like Reiki type practices,
Right.
but just the connection to energy that you get on psychedelic medicines is fascinating, especially to me as a scientific skeptic who will admit I don't understand everything about the world. Psychedelics like that, they've made me extremely open to all the unseen things, but to experience it, it's just fascinating. The body-based healing, the body connections that come through psychedelics, I really am a fan of.
Yeah. It reminds me of, was it James Fadiman said at this Scepter conference about this yoga position he was able to get into?
That was
Fadiman?
That was Andy Weil.
Andy Weil, yeah.
Yeah. He tells a story of when he was at Harvard back in the 60s, around then sometime. He was a little younger than Ram Dass Tim Leary, Dick Alpert, Tim Leary. And he was experimenting with both Hatha yoga, first of all, and then he encountered LSD, I believe it was. It might have been mescaline, but I think it was LSD. And he was trying to get in this pose called plow pose, where you're laying on your back, your feet go up and behind your head, and if you go into the full expression of the pose, your feet touch the ground. I don't know if you can picture it. I could demonstrate it, but we'd have to adjust the camera.
Yeah.
And he could not get into plow pose in normal waking consciousness yet. He does LSD and tries it, boom, he's in it.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, wait, what just happened? The next day he tries it, could not get into it. But he's like, wait a second, I didn't make that up.
Right.
I know I was tripping, but that happened. And so next time he's in an LSD experience, he does it and receives this kind of confirmation. Okay, it is possible and something's going on where I'm getting in my own way. So he just inserted some diligent practice in, and before long he had it.
It makes me wonder, because I'm not a physician. I don't know the human anatomy that well, but I've heard people who do know it very well say that a lot of times flexibility isn't about the stretchiness of a tissue. It's about what your nervous system will allow you to do or not. Like,
yeah.
It's about like your nervous system saying, no, you can't go beyond this particular range of motion because we're afraid of injury.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people can get into a deeper stretch simply by breath work, which doesn't lengthen your tissues. It just allows tissues to relax, allows something for your nervous system to say, it's okay, sweetheart. You can, go beyond this particular range of motion.
Yeah, I've experienced that a lot in yoga, even without psychedelics on board, is the ability to navigate, carefully, safely, wisely past those self-imposed limitations in our bodies, where, with the right kind of approach, whether it's warm-up or some set and setting components or some sequential process to, relax the opposing muscles that might be just, otherwise telling you can't go there. It's pretty amazing to see how deep you can go, even safely, by getting through some of those obstacles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, cool, Reed. I am excited for Meet Delic next year. You and I will be going to the Horizons Conference in New York in another couple of weeks.
That'll be fun.
Looking forward to that. And hopefully many more conferences. I think this is, like we said, we're just at the starting blocks. There's going to be a lot more opportunities if folks who are listening are interested to attend a cool conference like this.
Indeed. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Reed. Thank you, dear listener, for listening. It means a lot to me. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Novamind, a mental health company that specializes in psychedelic medicine and research. You can learn more about Novamind's mission to increase access to legal, safe, and evidence-based psychedelic medicine at novamind.ca. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. If you'd like to reach out to us with questions, suggestions, scathing criticisms, etc., please email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. Thanks again.